Last Tuesday, I was lucky enough to be invited to a demonstration by a wonderfully talented Korean potter called MoonDoBang. He showed us how he throws and trims pots, and it was really lovely to meet him after following him on Instagram for so many years. Tom Kemp was also there, and Lily Matesick, who's going to make a YouTube video all about her experience attending one of his workshops. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to her channel in the description. Anyway, I purchased one of these mugs from him, and just look at this wrapping. This thing is bulletproof. Moon makes wonderfully refined porcelain for the most part. It's all glazed very simply, allowing his absurdly high level of craftsmanship to show through. But this really is just the tip of the iceberg for him. He makes tons of huge, impressive forms that are faceted, altered and thrown from giant lumps of clay. And in the description of this video I'll leave links to his website and his Instagram if you'd like to check out more of what he does, which I highly recommend. Anyway, MoonDoBang throws off the hump, which is something I haven't done in ages. And he also trims pots using a very specific tool to do about 90% of the work. One of which he very kindly gave me. It's made from soft spring steel that's sharpened to a really deadly edge, and it's this that he trims the outsides of his pots with, and the foot rings of his bowls. And so in this video, as I was influenced after watching him work, I'm going to return and do some throwing off the hump, which I haven't done since my apprenticeship in Mashiko, Japan, and then I'll trim the undersides of those pots with this turner. The one thing I know is that MoonDoBang makes it look much easier than it is. And thank you, Moon, if you do watch, for the gifts. I'll be using the mugs and bowls you gave me for a very long time to come. So, this process will begin by throwing some pots off the hump. This is when, instead of working with many individual lumps of clay which you weigh out and wedge, you wedge up one large lump until it's really mixed and smooth. And then you throw one small portion of this at the very top into a pot, slice that off, draw up more clay from beneath it, and throw that into another one, and so on, until the entire hump of clay has been used up. It's then taken over to the wheel, rolled like this, so it has a rounded base. This way when thrown against the wheel it doesn't trap any air beneath it, and it's also firmly chucked against a dry surface. If your wheel head is covered in slip already, then it won't stick. It's then firmly patted all the way around to centre it, and to mix the surface clay with the clay on the inside, which is really important if, say, you've left the clay wrapped up overnight, wedged and prepared, but not yet thrown with, as it will develop a harder outer shell. The next step is to centre the lump of clay properly with water, first by drawing it up from the bottom like so, and then I lean the top portion forward. This causes the lump of clay to draw that top portion back down without having to use excessive force. This is something Moon spoke about a lot, the fact that your movements with the clay should never be forced or overly harsh. Instead it has to be moved around gently, coaxed and persuaded to go in the right direction, rather than forcefully shoving it into the right place. Anyway, this video won't be so much about throwing off the hump, it's the trimming I really want to focus on. But essentially, once the lump of clay is centred, you squeeze the material up into a taller cone, designating a small amount of clay you wish to throw with. And you'll notice throughout this process, instead of constantly getting more water, I scrape slip off the wheel and off the cone to throw with. I've always found it's a bit easier to do this when throwing off the hump, as the water and slip naturally accumulates on the hump itself, instead of immediately just running off the wheel and flowing into the tray. That designated portion of clay at the top is then opened up, and then I collar that mass up, thinning out those thick walls to make the next pull easier. From this point, the pot is thrown much like you normally would if you were throwing just on the wheel head. And I have to say, the very best thing about throwing off the hump is not having to hunch over so much to work. As you're working with the clay higher up, you don't bend your back so much, which means it's far more comfortable to work like this for longer periods of time. I should probably practice this method a lot more to see me into the future, especially for shapes such as mugs and bowls, and pots I make many hundreds of. But it really is tricky when you get set in your ways when it comes to making. I know this can be a really accurate method for making pots, but again it just requires practice, and I'm already really accurate when throwing individual lumps. So going back and learning this method properly would be like taking one step back, but eventually to gain two forward. But in some ways I like making pots where I know exactly where the bottom of the clay is in relation to the wheel head, whereas when throwing off the hump you always need to leave more in the bottom. Not only to provide you with material to lift off with, but it's also tricky to establish where the bottom of the internal base is in relation to where you cut the pot off on the outside. But again, that's something learned through practice. Another great thing about throwing off the hump is not having to weigh out all those individual pieces. In the long run, this saves an extraordinary amount of time, unless of course you're lucky enough to have an apprentice to do that job for you. Yet, for my style of pots that are angular and sharp, throwing atop a hump like this, is actually rather tricky, as sometimes when you throw a certain shape, the entire hump of clay underneath the pot will lean slightly to one side. And for angular pots, which are harder to control once those harsh changes in direction have been created, the whole vessel leaning to one side or the other can be rather detrimental, as tight angles in the walls of clay don't hold their shape nearly as well as a curved one. I'm also trying to cut the pots off in a way Moon did, but badly. You hold a needle tool in one hand, which you push into the hump to separate it, aiming for the very middle of the hump. At the same time, you squeeze in with a wetted left hand, collaring in the clay to make a smaller portion that you actually have to slice through. And with any luck, it comes off easily, like this. And as you can see, as I work, the hump of clay gets smaller and smaller, until you're left with a lump that's large enough for that last individual piece. I found slicing them off the hump using Moon's method actually quite tricky, especially compared to the technique I used in Mashiko, Japan, when I was throwing hundreds and hundreds of Yunomi. They are teetering a bit from side to side, but this unevenness will be really easy to fix at the leather hard stage. Pour. Pour. Oh, thank you. Yeah. See. Pour. Oh. It's now the following day, and these bowls were left uncovered overnight on their rims. This way their thicker, damp bases could dry out properly. Now, I will also be trimming the insides of each. These are Florian Gadsby pots, after all, but I won't focus on that in this video. It's turning the undersides, the walls, and the foot ring, which are the important parts. It's also worth stating that Moon trims on chucks. These are much larger mounds of clay which the pots sit upon, and they're trimmed to individually fit the pot he's making, whereas I'm just going to secure mine in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, as I didn't have time to make a chuck, and as thrown pieces, they can take a long time to dry out enough in order to be used. So, let's begin. When turning the outsides of the pots, I'm going to try and use the corner of the turning tool, and I fully expect this first attempt to go badly. Looking back at what I'm doing here, I'm obviously holding the tool in the wrong position. That's why it isn't really removing much material. I should be holding the blade so it comes in at a tighter angle to the walls, like you can see me just beginning to do here. Now it really begins to bite. The blade itself is really sharp, but as the material is soft spring steel, there's plenty of give to it, which personally is something I'm not very used to, and it's for that reason I'm holding the blade so close to the end, as I have to stabilise it. If I hold this tool even an inch further back along the handle, it ends up chattering the surface, like so, leaving these repeated lines in the clay which I don't particularly like, so I'm just going to switch back to some of the tools I know to fix this. Now the thing I'm really interested in about this tool is using it to trim the insides of feet, as by easing that sharp corner out it should gouge away a ton of clay really easily, and due to the right angle shape of the tool itself, it should leave me with the exact shape I want in the final form of the pot, without having to fuss around too much. But I think the tool's shape is actually what led to me making this error over and over again, where the vertical part of the blade would catch on the outer part of the foot ring, gouging out a chunk of clay and leaving an uneven mess in its wake, which I'd then have to trim down to even it out, making the pot shorter than I'd like. The key is obviously not trimming all the way to the edge, and I found by turning the inner portion of the footwell to have a slope, it was less likely that the vertical portion of the blade would catch, but that's much easier said than done, and I'm still going to go on and make this mistake a good dozen times or so. Ideally, I want to trim all the way from the centre to the outer portion of the foot, and I even changed the position I was holding the tool so that it was more vertical or even leaning slightly inward, all in order to keep the vertical portion of the blade away from the foot, and that generally gave me much better results. I'm so used to trimming deep foot rings like this that I barely even think about the process anymore, and I suppose the difference between this tool and the ones I normally use is the fact that the blade on this is basically made up of lots of harsh right angles, whereas those I normally use are curved, meaning there's less for it to actually catch on, I think. This specific loop tool feels more reciprocal for deep footwells, like this, although at the same time, due to its shape, it being curved, it's much more difficult to trim a lovely flat surface on that vertical portion of the footwell on the inside. Okay, that's not a bad first attempt, but my hands still feel rather awkward and clumsy when holding and using this tool, and that translates into the surfaces I'm trimming on the pot, I think, and hopefully after 7 more attempts, things will begin to feel a bit more natural. Okay, with this next part I'm going to be a lot more aggressive, pushing the tool in harder and holding it at a tighter angle to the clay, together with really digging in the corner of the blade, as compared to using the flat side of it, and that worked much better. It's far easier to dig in that small point of contact than it is pressing in the entire length of the blade. And when you get this tool carving in just the right way, it really does leave a lovely, smooth surface. Another tip Moon told us when using trimming tools like this is to spin the wheel really fast, and I can't tell you how much of a difference this made. It's strange, as with my loop tools I can afford to go a bit slower, and I can still achieve surfaces that I'm very happy with, but with this trimmer, speed definitely helps. Right, back to the foot. This, I think, is going to be the challenging part of these pots. And again, I just let that tool catch the outer edge. It's really tricky when you're so used to something to try and force my hands and my brain to do it in a different way. As when I normally turn feet, this movement is basically just muscle memory. And whilst I can do that for about 90% of this motion, when the blade nears the outer edge, I have to stop. And I think it was around this point that this rule began to stick. And when you get into the rhythm of removing clay layer by layer like this, it really feels so clean and efficient. But I still found myself switching back to the loop tools to do the finishing touches. I hold the tool with a fist grip, like so, when pressing the base of the blade into the clay. It's pushed in, but not too much, and then I glide the tool out horizontally. And here's where I should have stopped. Instead I was overeager and the tool bit and tore away some of the clay from a portion of the pot I wanted to leave intact. Again, this is getting frustrating. I know it's such a small change, but I kept making the same mistake, and I feel like this is more infuriating when you are quite good at something. I know how to trim pots, I know how to use tools. I know this clay really well, and carving away the clay like this feels comfortable all the way up until I get to that outer edge. And throughout this entire process I was thinking the next time I'll get it right, the next time. But when it keeps happening, there's usually something you're doing wrong, be it the position of my hand, or maybe the clay is too soft, or maybe, and perhaps most simply, I just need more practice. Now, the other thing this tool looked really useful for was leveling the base. And this is another thing Moon made look very easy. And I was successful at doing this a number of times, shaving away the clay in lovely ribbons, like so. But it's paramount that the blade's tip remains in the very center of the pot. Otherwise, if the blade's edge gets drawn forward, which it will naturally want to do as the clay spins and hits against it, you'll begin to lose control and the blade will begin cutting away far too much material. This shaving down of the base is easier to do when the foot is much narrower, as with an expanse this wide there's simply so much clay hitting into the blade at once, it's almost impossible to control, and even just being a few millimeters off will cause the blade to suddenly gouge away tons of material. And again, if the clay is too soft, well, that just exacerbates the problem. It reminds me that trimming pots really is a process where you have to get so many small things right, especially the condition of the clay. I think with loop tools you can get away working with clay that is slightly on the soft side, whereas with this steel trimmer that Moon used, he said that the clay has to be about 80% of the way to bone dry. And I think maybe in all of these attempts, while the upper portions of the pots are at that stage, the bases were all perhaps slightly too damp, which means the clay clings a bit too much. If you're ever trimming and all the turnings simply stick to the blade, then that's a sure sign that the clay of the pot is still far too soft to be worked. And I think with this steel tool that's even more relevant. I've always found it interesting how potters use different types of trimming tools in the West and in the East. In the UK, Europe and the United States, we favour looped tools, I think, whereas in Asia, these types of tools are more common. They're simple, sharp, and many potters end up making their own. In fact, Moon gave us all some spring steel lengths to make our own from using a bench grinder. Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but I would love to hear your ideas, if you have any. I've always thought that given Asia's prowess when it comes to handmade pottery, there must be some significant fact as to why these are the types of tools that are primarily used. Are we in the West just more likely to spend money on tools that have been made by others? But I know that wasn't the case in the past, as most potters, even here in the UK, would have probably made their own tools. So why is there this difference between the shapes of the tools we use? Or is it simply the fact that historically this craft has developed differently in different parts of the world, and these variances remain to this day? Craft being so traditional and all, this feels like the most likely answer to me. And I suppose whilst these tools have permeated the West, when I spent 6 months in Japan, I didn't see one looped turning tool being used. So, my new rule for turning these feet, for this first pass especially, is to do about 80% of the work, and then I stop and trim a slope on the outer portion of the foot, removing that pesky region of clay that often runs into the blade and causes it to catch. These long coils tools like this create are wonderful, and it's when the clay cleaves off like this that it leaves a lovely smooth surface underneath, and I think that's half the battle when trimming. Sometimes when you work, you will leave a slightly chattered surface, and there are other times, when you're working at a different angle, perhaps, that the blade leaves a lovely and smooth, burnished surface, especially when you're working with grogged clays like this, as they tend to chatter more as the blade bounces off the large particles contained in the body. This pot's base was really uneven, hence why it's tipping over to one side, so I flip it over onto its rim, centre it roughly, and then carefully let the turning tool just slice away the highest part that spins around. When this works, it feels great, and I'm sure if I were to repeat this hundreds or thousands of times, it would be an effortless process, without catching and cutting away too much like you saw me do previously. Ultimately, with trimming, I think it's about finding the right tools for you that's the most important thing. You need to get familiar with them, to understand their limits, and understanding when certain tools are best to use depending on the state of the clay you're working with. I suppose with 15 years of trimming with loop tools under my belt, switching to a tool like this can be very jarring, but I know I'd get used to it, eventually. In a way, I found I had more success with this tool the less of the blade I used. For instance, gouging in the tip of the right angle worked really well and it never chattered, but as soon as I started using the longer expanse of the blade, it left an uneven surface, although it really did depend on the angle the blade made contact with the clay. And it was only towards the end of my trimming session that I figured out that actually there's a better way of holding the tool when turning the base, and that's like this. Although you can only press the blade in so deep from this angle, I did though feel as if I had a lot more control, and the chance that it would snag on the outer edge was far less likely, although probably still not impossible. Even when watching this footage back, if you compare this video to the stuff shown at the beginning, my turning at this later stage looks far more confident and under control, and when trimming with the tool in this upright position, when the blade approaches the inner portion of the foot, I angle the metal inward so it's less likely to snag. Anyway, would I recommend a tool like this? Well, yes, if it's something you're going to get and rely on, then definitely go ahead, if you're willing to invest time into what's probably a bit more difficult a learning curve. I know I'm biased, but compared to loop tools, I feel like there's just a lot more that can go wrong when using one of these. The length of metal is flexible, which means it can move as you're turning, which isn't ideal, especially if you aren't expecting it. I also think that curved blades are just a bit more forgiving. They're less likely to catch, and if you are a beginner, I think that looped tools are probably the way to go, and you'll probably find that a potter trained in Japan, Korea, or China would tell you to go with something like this. I think for the cost and flexibility, if you are able to make tools like this for yourself, then that's a great way to go. Moon told us that a blade like this will have to be sharpened again after being used to trim about 200 pots, but at the cost of a few pence per length of metal, it's practically nothing. Compare that to a tungsten carbide tool that costs anywhere between 80 to £100 and remains sharp even after trimming thousands of pots. Yes, they are exceedingly fragile, but I guess what you're paying for is convenience, as I still haven't sharpened my tungsten carbide trimmers in something like 5 years and they still feel just as sharp as the day I got them. But let's face it, trimmers that expensive aren't really available to everyone. In fact, I discourage their use if you're a beginner, and the analogy I always use is this: you would never learn how to drive in a sports car. And I feel a bit as if the tool given to me by MoonDoBang fits into that same category, not due to its expense, but due to how technically difficult it is to use. Anyway, not only did I have a lot of fun throwing and trimming these, but earlier in the week I also got to meet MoonDoBang. And whilst I was most excited to see how he trims, it was watching him throw large pots, especially the moon jar he made at the end of his demonstration, that was really eye-opening, and it's made me itch to get back on the wheel and throw some larger pieces. Anyway, sorry for the sort of rambling video. I'm always really curious about what kinds of tools other potters use, and as soon as Moon handed me the trimmer, I knew I had to use it the following day, whether I had a good time working with it or not. It doesn't matter, although it certainly made me realise just how much of an expert he is. And if you think I'm good at making pots, well, he's on a different planet. And a lovely man too, despite us not being able to understand a single word the other said. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch. And, as always, I'll see you next time.